And we are live. Welcome everyone to Playing in Tactic. I am Jorge Orchilles and
Justin Elze.
Bryson Bort.
And today who do we have?
Dan Borges.
There you go. We practiced that.
Yeah.
Clearly we didn't.
So Dan, you want to give some background on yourself, what you've been up to, maybe your recent book you published?
Yeah. So for those that don't know me, my name's Dan Borges. I've been involved in offensive security for a while. I recently wrote this book, Adversarial Tradecraft in Cybersecurity. It's a pretty awesome book, but it's largely based on my experiences doing CCDC red teaming. So the book is kind of about cybersecurity competitions and how these offensive teams can attack the defensive teams and how they can respond, especially when they know each other are there. When both sides are aware of each other, you get a lot of kind of adversarial decisions at play. So I've been doing CCDC for like 8 years, and at a certain point, I was like, all these new schools just keep coming in, and obviously they're new students, so they don't know what we've told them. So I just need to like write down these lessons learned for students, so that way they can have like a leg up when they come into the competition.
Nice. So how long did it take you to write the book end to end? Like, I know that's a giant undertaking doing it by yourself.
Yeah, so the book took about 8 months, about a month a chapter. And it was hard to write it all myself, you know, like the thing they don't tell you when, I guess they do, when you're going to write a book is that there's just a lot of writing, you know, so it takes a lot of time. But I really enjoyed it because it was almost like a sabbatical, you know, like I got to take this time with these techniques that I've always really enjoyed and kind of spend the time labbing them out. And like, there's one I want to talk to you, but like I've always wanted to build a universal keylogger, like a keylogger that works on every platform. And I kind of dug into that when I was writing the book, and I realized why it's so hard. And hopefully we can talk about that later.
Yeah, the $1 million question, would you write another book?
I think I might, but I'm going to take a few years before I do it again.
That's awesome, though. No, but yeah, definitely lots of work. Thank you for that. Got to skim through it, have not read it all the way. I'm more of a Kindle reader, so you know, everyone pops up their book. I have my Kindle over here. But yeah, no, good stuff. And yeah, I guess let's talk a little bit about your experience, like how you got into red teaming and how's that different from enterprise red teaming?
Yeah, so the way I got into it was very much through collegiate competitions. Like I went to school for information security a few years back. That's a thing now. And in doing that, like I played in a bunch of these hacking competitions, and then when I got out, I got into CCDC on the red team. And it's very different than real world exercises. Like you kind of hit it on the head. Like a big thing that we do in the CCDC is kind of like the key logging, the screenshots, a lot of this like post exploitation that you really don't do necessarily in client engagements. Specifically all the way to the end that like we'll do destructive attacks at the end, or we'll ransomware the students. It's things you would never do on a client, like ever, unless they specifically asked for it. But there's a lot of those different aspects. Like I just found myself preparing these keyloggers and preparing these tools that I wasn't really using on other engagements. Don't get me wrong. When I do use them on red teaming engagements, they've been very effective. But for some reason, it's just not like the normal bag of tricks.
And why is that?
You're
muted.
We lost you.
Oh, sorry. I think it's two parts. Like one, when you use these techniques, they do give you more insight into what the team is doing. But it's also like every time you do another one of these things, it's another detectable technique. So if you don't need it, I could see it, you know, like creating files on disk, like constantly polling API calls that are probably risky. So it can be pretty risky, like if they have EDR.
And if I can interject, the other part of that is it depends on human interaction, right? I can't steal what's not there. And so many of the techniques that work are ones where there are lots of ways to harvest credentials and to use different techniques to get there. And in this case, I have to wait for the user to do something. In a CCDC competition, right? How often are the users actually going to be doing traditional operation techniques that are, maintenance that would allow those things to be exposed versus in a real world where that might happen, but now I'm constrained by the amount of time I have to do it versus, right, just drop Bloodhound and own the AD and like, hey, I win.
Yeah, exactly. That's a great point. Like that's one of the things that's really different about the CCDC competition is like you have 48 hours where you know both parties are there doing everything they can. So for the defenders, it's like, you know, they know the attacker is there. They just have to find them. For the attacker, they can take advantage of other people being on the same host.
Yeah, I think it incentivizes what I call the smash and grab, right? Move quick, move fast. You can be noisy because you're going to be continually doing it. They already know you're there, so there's no stealth or element of surprise. Some of the techniques that we've used in competitions like that, or like more of the paintball where you have the red and blue components and the red and blue components on top of each other, has been, since you can kind of cheat and know that, creating things that, you know, if I automatically see a process out of this, just block it. If I see traffic that's not this, just automatically block it. Things you can't do in a real enterprise because you have to be more fine-tuned. But in that kind of environment, you know, you can get away with it.
Beacon set at 1 second.
Absolutely, yeah. So that's more or less like our playbook is smash and grab. Like we want to get in there as fast as possible. At the Nationals, the strategy changes a little different. Like we try to stay very quiet the first day, so that way we get caught in backups. But yeah, like across the board, our strategy is like, you know, we want to be in there, like George was saying, T0, T1. We want to be in their machines. We want to drop persistence, and then we just want to like kind of sit there and monitor. But yeah, like you were saying, like it's much harder to do that in a real world operation where you want to be much more stealthy. You have a longer engagement window.
I did appreciate from your book that you got into all the theory behind, you know, like attacking, planning, that sort of thing. Like that usually gets missed if people write a book about red teaming or pen testing. It's, you know, do OSINT, start hacking, like run all the tools. Like at least you got into like, you know, run books versus checklists and like the principles behind like, you know, planning and things like that. You even mentioned KPI, so I'm sure some managers out there will be very excited about KPIs for hacking and doing red teaming. So that was a good thing. I had always been against checklists, but more of a fan of run books because I didn't like to constrain people by saying, hey, you need to do these steps and these orders. Like trying to give people, you know, creative freedom, but still follow some form has always been something that's hard to maintain. But I like that you hit on it in the book.
Yeah, I agree with that as well. In my 2-day red team course, it's like the entire first day is planning, which includes attack infrastructures. But like most technical people that go there are like, why are we talking about frameworks and doing things repetitively? And it's like, well, because if you do this at an enterprise, you need to have a process and a plan. And, you know, you don't just show up and say, we're going to YOLO red team and go in, because they're not going to go with you. They're going to go with someone else. So I appreciated that quite a bit as well from the book. And, you know, that's the reality for anyone wanting to get into red team. There is a whole part that you might not like, which is planning and reporting. And it's like 50% of your entire engagement. But yeah, that area is definitely good. And to checklist, right? It's just being able to have something repeatable, especially when you're working on an internal red team or trying to scale up, right? I don't know where you work, Dan, or, you know, if you run an internal team, but, you know, you started with like 1 or 2 people, then they start specializing. Now you have like the infrastructure person, the developer that doesn't do ops, the ops person that doesn't do dev, and keeping all that and moving, right? It gets harder, and your book covers that. So that's another area that I like. You know, some people might just skip it and go, you know, straight to chapter 4 or 5, and, you know, get to a fun part.
Yeah, you guys hit on so many good points. Yeah, I was cautious about putting that stuff in there because it's not so technical. But on the same point, like that's such a big part of the thing, both long-term planning and short-term planning, building that team, making sure you have building that team and making sure you have that different expertise. And then just like you were saying, George, like these are things you're going to need on every op. You're going to need your C2. So you should have a way to deploy that. And that can be a run book. And then eventually you can take that run book and automate it. And then you could have scripts that deploy your C2. And that's another reason I like run books, is it's one way for like somebody that knows something to transfer their knowledge to other team members and get them up to speed. But it also kind of like leaves a template if somebody wants to automate something in the future. And it's like, hey, here's the process we're really trying to get down.
Did it go into that? Sorry, I haven't gotten to that part. But do you like cover like Terraform or Ansible and all that for building the attack infra?
I don't cover Terraform in this or anything like that, but I do really suggest those things. Like, that's awesome if you can stand those up. I do cover planning your next stages. So obviously you would set up your C2, and then I cover automating deploying a stage 2 implant from a stage 1. In our example, we use Meterpreter and Sliver, and then we just like write RC scripts to chain them together. But it's a similar idea. Like, for example, on the CCDC team, like, we know we always want to pivot our shell. Like, maybe we throw something with Meterpreter, and then we always want to pivot to our second C2. So we just want to automate all of that as much as possible. And if it's not automated, like, we'll have little one-liners, and if somebody else lands on a box, we'll be like, run this one-liner, you know, and then we'll be good. You'll have persistence laid down, so if you lose your shell, it's okay.
Have you done work with any of the other, like, so RIT has like ISTS? Have you done work with any of those other like CCDC style events?
I haven't actually participated in ISTS, but a bunch of the people that play in that also play in CCDC.
Yeah.
And then I've done a lot of Pros versus Joes, which is the big attack defense competition. They do that at B-Sides LV, and that's neat because that's like everybody's defending and then also attacking each other.
That's why I asked about ISTS, because I've done the red team there several times, and that was always a weird concept where the teams could attack each other on top of things. So you would have schools bringing in different root kits and things like that, and it added a real different dynamic. So it's just kind of just a change of pace from the standard, you know, red versus blue.
Yeah, they threw that out at CCDC because we started doing really weird stuff. Like, we would go into one team's network, and then if they had the red team firewalled off, we would start attacking them from another team, and it made things way too confusing.
Fair enough.
So you want to talk about keyloggers and differences between a real op and a non-op. So I've personally tried this and would definitely love to know your opinion on all of that.
Yeah, so I guess first, like, what we're not going to talk about, because like keylogger is a broad word and a lot of stuff's like amorphous in computer security. So like we have those screenshot tools that like take pictures of your desktop. That I'm not going to call that a keylogger. That's just a screenshotter. And then the other thing that's kind of in the same bucket or near bucket is credential dumping tools, like tools that can find secrets on the box or tools that can get secrets out of memory. That's a huge topic on its own, so I'm not going to touch that. Just to be like clear, you know, when somebody's like, well, why didn't you mention Mimikatz or something? You know, it's just not this conversation.
If only there was a database called like a common knowledge or something that had the right terminology out there. So yes, key logging is what we're talking about, not all the other collection tactics.
All right, if you're gonna bring it up, we got MITRE, and MITRE gets it right. I just dropped that in our private chat. So this is the MITRE technique 1056, which is key logging. And then we're just talking about the sub-technique 001, key logging. And this page is huge. This page has 160 plus references on it. So it's interesting. It's like, you know, you'll find this in Metasploit, but a lot of these attackers use this technique. Like they'll build it into their malware. And on Windows, key logging is pretty straightforward. At least from my perspective, there's two major APIs that people focus on. It's the get async key state and the get key state. And the way they do this normally is like they loop it and poll it. So they'll just sit in there like get async key state every millisecond or something. And when I was working on the defensive side, that's actually fairly hard to detect because there's a lot of things that are always polling get async key state. So one of the tricks there, if you are getting detected with your Windows keylogger and it's just doing get async key state, it's not like hooking anything. One of the tricks there you can do is increase your polling time. So you poll less often. It'll be a little more lossy, but it's very hard for EDRs to detect that because what they're doing is they're just they're hooking that call to get async key state, and then they're seeing how often it's called. So that's like a neat little trick. But Windows and Linux, more or less, it's straightforward. Like you just tap the device on Mac. There's an event tap you can do, which lets you hook the keyboard, and then you start to receive key commands from the keyboard. And similar on Linux, you have to define the device that's in use, and then you can hook that device and basically just start reading from it, and you can read the keystrokes. So all that seemed straightforward, and I was like, I can totally build a cross-platform keylogger and go. I'll just have like these 3 different implementations, and we'll go for it. And then I started deploying this stuff on Linux servers where I thought it would be really valuable because that's where they're doing all their remote ops. And I wasn't getting anything. And it turns out it's because SSH, it creates a pseudo terminal. So there's no keyboard input. So I'm sitting there like trying to keylog and I'm not getting anything from these Linux devices. And I spent some time looking that up in the book because like it was always just this like headache to me. I was like, why can't I keylog on Linux? You know? And I came across a really old tool, trying to find it real quick. It's called rootsh. The original tool is like 11 years old, and then they rewrote it in a Go tool on GitHub. But it's really silly. It's literally, originally it was a C program, and it's just a shell wrapper, and it just replaces your default login shell and then records all of the commands to a log. So the way you would deploy it is if your user, like you knew they were going to abuse some user, in etc password, you would change his default login shell from like bin bash to your bin root sh or whatever it is. And then it's basically like a shell wrapper. Like you're just pushing them through your little shell that records everything. Very similar to like, I guess not like bash history, but like the way EDRs collect history. It's like they hook it, but this is just a wrapper. So I thought that was really interesting, you know?
How was the performance on that, right? Because you mentioned the actual calls that we need to look at, but you know, I've looked at a couple C2s, and for example, a PowerShell implant does terrible crap when it tries to get a keylogger, right? Like you've seen it, right? Where it's like 12 keys, but you only hit the key once, or it misses stuff and all that. We see that on PowerShell quite a bit. Obviously, the easier example. Python, you know, a little better, but still not better. Obviously, native stuff better. How was Go? You know, one of these in Go, just for example.
Yeah, the rootsh I've had a lot of success with. It basically captured everything pretty clearly, and then I added timestamps to it, so everything was like pretty laid out, and I wasn't really missing keys. Although you're right, like it can get kind of lossy sometimes. For CCDC, this is a trick we use, but we have a keylogger that does nothing but keylog and then exfiltrates over UDP. And because of the UDP nature of that, that's a little lossy, which sucks when you're trying to record passwords and you miss one character. But the rootsh and that stuff has been pretty good. That's been pretty reliable. I liked that you hit on different implementations of keyloggers, like you have PowerShell or Python, and there are some people out there that try to do like universal keyloggers in Python. I'm just hesitant to use that stuff because I think it goes back to planning. When you're planning your techniques, not only do you want to plan what you want to do, but you want to plan how you implement it. Like, are you going to be using Python for a lot of ops, or maybe you're using PowerShell and you're trying to stay in memory? And I at least with CCDC, I try to avoid interpreted languages because I think it's easier for the students to get source and then say exactly what we did. Like, quick little story. Back in the day, we used to use a bash wrapper to, you know, we would just curl a bash with a pseudo prompt to get all of our stuff down. And the students forensically recovered this off the box. We deleted it, but we didn't SRM it. And literally, they just had a playbook of all of our techniques for that year. It was the most painful thing. It was like not even obfuscated.
Have you looked at keyloggers on mobile?
No, I haven't. That sounds really cool.
Yeah, no, there's it's a different issue because also the inputs are coming in differently. But then, I mean, you're basically having some variant of Android. I mean, they're all like Linux distros, right? And then how they're handling it is a little different. That's something cool. I'm curious to see even more is in the future is mobile starting to come into the red teaming space.
That's a tough one though with red, like who owns the phone with BYOD, because we've tried to like expand into that before, and we've always run into that like, hey, well, how much leeway do we have here to kind of abuse this path? So I wish people would go back to issuing phones because then it's straightforward. Hey, you guys can, your company owns it, do whatever you want. Well,
Justin, we have that same problem in a remote workforce culture anyway, where we have mixed assets that are now in scope for when you're doing an assessment.
Yeah, that's always fun. That's all about guardrails now.
That was the worst. It used to be like phishing, and everybody would check their email from their phone. None of my payloads work here. What's going on?
Yeah, on the key logging thing, sorry to go back to it, but my last question, because it's the other issue I've had with keyloggers, is that if the person is typing a lot and you're just leaving the keylogger on capture, again, based on the implementation, there's only so much like buffer of keys that it's going to store before your implant either gets really big and blows up, or you don't lose keys. So have you had experience with that? And like, what do? Do you output to disk and then exfiltrate that, or just dump the keys every so often? What tactics do you use there?
Typically when I do it, I'm writing to disk, which is also a good behavioral way to detect it, right? Like if you see somebody polling get async key state and then that process is also writing to disk, you probably have a problem. But typically I'll write to disk and I'll try to like hide it as like a user icon or like something like very benign, and I'll just change the name. And yeah, once that file grows beyond a certain size, it becomes very obvious. Like, what is this icon doing that's like a gig or something, Like, why is this so massive? But I've never actually filled the disk with that stuff. I filled the disk with a screenshot utility a few times. And I don't know if it was in a competition, but I've definitely just like left it running by accident on my VM and come back and my VM has crashed.
Did you accidentally talk about detection there? Did you say something around being able to detect certain get key states, etc., and then writing to disk? Are you a blue teamer here? What's going on?
Secret blue team.
All you need to do is just find one of those super chatty apps that runs out of app data and just write everything there. Now that everybody runs, since everybody's got their logging goes to that folder. But, yeah, such is life.
I think we have an audience question from Eric.
A good one.
What is your take on building scripts and tools in Go versus Python?
You guys want to take a shot, or do you want me to?
So I can go first. We've avoided Go, at least at the red team here, just because we saw that it got so popular, and the way things tend to go is it gets really popular on InfoSec and red team side on Twitter, and then some malware chases it, and then everybody focuses on it. So we thought it was going to be one of those waves of, this probably isn't super useful to highly invest in. However, for like the dropper space and like the stage 0 that we kind of talked about in the past, I think it's very good for that. We just didn't heavily invest, at least on our side, in tooling in Go.
Yeah, so I'll follow on that because that makes sense. It took me a long time to get around even the concept of Go, because I'm old school and size used to be a really big deal. And Go is just like, no, everything is here and everything is big. And I was like, who the hell could use that? And it took me a couple of years of going to the conferences and having yet another, here's how I did Go for offense. And I would sit there and be like, all right, like I'm getting it. Like I appreciate that the dependencies are there for me to be cross-compiled. That sounds cool. And I think that's why it makes sense at the, as a stage 0, because I can keep that inherently small with limited functionality. And I know it's going to work almost anywhere. So I'll kind of echo Justin on that, but I'm still having a hard time of letting go. Again, no pun intended. I feel like we can't stop saying it, of just where its limitations are for like more real like development.
Yeah. George, you want to say something? Those are great points.
I have no comment. I'm one of those red team operators that does not even claim to know anything about coding or scripting. Of course, I can read a little, but that is it. So I will let you answer that.
So very, very similar to what the other guys said. Justin, you were saying like you were afraid it was going to draw the eyes of researchers, and just at the Mandiant M conference, you had a really good talk on reversing Go applications where they like show how to get rid of all these like junk functions and how to like really drill into the user defined functions. I was trying to Google that. I couldn't find it. And then Bryson, you were saying like they're huge, and it sucks. Like for a long time, I had this dream of like everything Go. I can have arbitrary XEs process injected into other binaries. And like now I can kind of achieve that dream with Donut and SRDI and stuff, but it like the shellcode I'm injecting into these binaries is massive. Like it doesn't make sense. So you really need either a large cave to inject it into, or like binject. Like one of my goals there was like, let me write arbitrary Go binaries in GScript and then inject them with a binject and like bury them in these other executables. And it's hard because it's so big and I have to find such a huge slack space or whatever in these binaries. So that's definitely a drawback. But
Yeah.
one of the reasons, oh, go ahead.
I was just gonna say that's why like process hollowing is like such a thing now, because like we did something, it worked very well, and now they're detecting it, so we move on, and now like probably like I would say most organizations aren't doing a great job. I know you all test more orgs on that side, but yeah, great point. And we should probably bring the Wolver on to talk a little bit about Donut and de-invoke on a future episode.
I feel great knowing I'm not alone and I wasn't crazy, right? I think it's hard sometimes when we see these talks and we, the InfoSec Twitter view, and one, of course, we lose nuance. I'm just going to throw that out there. But two is it's hard to peel back behind what is just a research level versus what really is and what works in the environment and what works for teams. And as Justin was looking at it, how's this going to work for me in the overall industry as, like as the CTO of his organization and making an investment from that level.
The other part of the question was interesting too, because it was, versus Python, right? So, like way back, people were building shellcode loaders in Python because, you could py-to-exe it, and AV had a hard time with that. Now, if you like py-to-exe like something completely benign and it hits virus total or AV, they just tag it as this is malicious. So that kind of, that makes that whole space very interesting. I've seen people all the time with like legit tools. We have one at work that was a report generator. We py-to-exe'd it, and Defender was, calling it out as bad. And we're like, there's nothing in this that's bad. So I think in the Go space, you have a lot more, latitude to kind of, get around that piece. But like on the Python side, you're kind of stuck with py-to-exe and py-to-installer.
Unless you can get the Python runtime to run in memory, which, might be some cool white papers out there on how to do that.
So just to go back to the good points ago, because I said the bad points and I never finished. It's kind of exactly like what Justin's saying. Like, if you look at py-to-exe, the one thing I wanted was native binaries, because I want to like either hide them and like do the DLL search order hijacking, or just like hide them on disk somewhere for persistence. So I liked that aspect of it. I liked that I could build these native binaries. I also liked that I could go cross-platform, Windows, Linux, Mac. Doing internal red teaming like at a cross-platform shop, that was really nice, because I could write like one kind of piece of code, and then I would generate these 3 executables, and then use JavaScript to like fingerprint the browsers and say who gets which executable. So that kind of kept my dev time down like just a little bit. It was still a pain in the butt. And then I think there was another thing about like I don't know if it was the runtimes, or basically one of the reasons I like it over Python is I don't want them to get the source code back. And then AV, like the Go binaries are good with AV, at least GScript has been for a long time. Defender's starting to catch up. And then nowadays, like researchers, it's really easy just to single Go binaries out from every other binary. So they're like anomalous in that regard. So that's kind of a negative against them. And, just one thing is like, as a hacker, I'm always trying to keep my eyes on the horizon. I'm always trying to say, like, what can I pivot to next that will, break away from the herd? And it's older, but, going back to it, like Bytebleeder's NIM stuff is not bad. You know what I mean? Like also cross compiles, much smaller. It's pretty cool stuff. So that's kind of the reason behind Go, is just switch it up. Like get a different language. It has a lot of useful features, but there are drawbacks for sure.
Yeah, the NIM stuff's a great topic, because you're basically going backwards, right? Like you have Go that is so giant and bloated, and you get these giant EXEs, and now you're working backwards with these other languages that basically compile down to like C, and you make EXEs out of them very easily, but there's a bunch of snippets so you can kind of build out what you're looking for without a giant lift on the coding front. So it's nice to see some changes. And like we said, we're always talking about what the trend is, what the value is going to be, and then long-term investment. But I think there's a place for everything. So it's nice to see all the innovation that comes from the Go side directly from CCDC, because there's been a whole bunch of like implant frameworks and things like that have come out from you guys.
Yeah, but now I see why you had mentioned Sliver earlier on. So anyone listening that wants to play with Go implants, Sliver is a great and free C2. It apart from compiling on Go, it actually has some really nice crypto as it builds the binary. Ends up taking like 10 minutes or more, depending on how much CPU you've got. But it's a pretty cool one. I'll post a link here.
takes you a little longer by the time you figure out how to set up your Go environment and Google around and go through that whole process. I think that's what made people so mad about Go initially, is because they're like, how do I just can't compile this thing? And then you're like, you Google and you set up your Go environment the first time, and then you're like, everything's great. Then you forget about it and start over again, and then everybody loses their mind.
It is peculiar, yeah. You need like all your folders in the right places, your environment variables pointing right.
So I think the last audience question here before we wrap up, what's the next implant language? You mentioned some stuff, right? You mentioned NIM, but what are your thoughts?
I like NIM. One thing I've been thinking about, and I don't even know if this is a good implant language, but like just deploying VMs to hosts, like Docker's running everywhere all the time. You know what I mean? So it'd be neat to like get stuff there, but you'd still need root control. You'd have to open up a lot of like ports or namespaces. So I don't know how great that would be. For me, I'm probably going to stick with Go just for a little bit longer. I feel like it still has some shelf life. There's some really cool projects coming out in Go right now. There's this one project. It's not quite complete yet, but it's by this guy, Red Skull. It's called Mitsubishi, and that looks really neat just because it's using Go templates and like memory injection to kind of carry out its things, and it uses this implementation. I think it's called Hell's Gate. I'm not 100% if it's Heaven's Gate or Hell's Gate, but it basically looks up like all of the direct API calls and uses those directly rather than querying the different system binaries. So that stuff looks really powerful. So I'm still kind of like, I might pivot to that, but I still use GScript pretty regularly. I still write a lot of my implants in Go. It's just a fast dev language for me. But I'll probably pick up NIM just as like a, always trying to play with something new.
Cool. Well, awesome. Any closing thoughts, and where can people reach you? Although I think our production team has done a good job, but we'll let you answer.
I want to say thanks, guys. I really appreciate this. I really appreciate the show. I think it's really cool what you guys are doing. I'm just glad that there's like people now talking about these tactics. And like Bryson, you hit a great point, right? Which is like so often you can't tell between what is like useful and what is just research, right? And I think if you have a show like this where you can kind of hash that out, that's really cool.
That's our goal.
Awesome. I think it was all a Twitter conversation that Justin started, I think. I don't know. It's hard to keep track of what happens on Twitter, but thanks a lot again for being on. Thank you to all of the listeners. Thank you for coming on. Thank you, Bryson and Justin, as usual. Hope you all have a good one.
Thank you.